So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about theories of demography. And we talked in the last class about the demographic transition theory in a little bit more detail than we talked in the introduction to this course. And by the way, just to let you know, I can see your chat today. So if you want to ask a question through the chat, I can see it while I'm presenting. And if you can also unmute yourself and ask a question if you want as well. And I stopped here in our last lecture about the second demographic transition. The idea is that fertility and mortality, they dropped a lot in these last centuries in several countries. Different countries are passing through different stages of the demographic transition. And those countries that are more advanced stages, if we just go back to the graph from the textbook, those countries that are on stage 4, in this case here, fertility and mortality are really in low levels. Fertility oscillates still a little bit, goes down and goes up sometimes. And more depending on the oscillation of fertility, we have either negative or positive growth, right? And so these are some examples of countries that are in different stages of the transition. But those countries that are in the more advanced stages in which fertility and mortality are really low levels, and fertility is now the major player on population growth in those countries because mortality stays low and is improving. People are living longer and longer throughout the years, but it doesn't improve so much. And fertility does oscillate in those countries, sometimes either going up or going down. And in those countries, what's actually driving even further declines of fertility are a series of factors that we did discuss mostly on that lecture about current trends of demographic indicators in the US, right? And so what is making fertility keep going lower in some countries or oscillating through time in those countries that are on stage 4 of the demographic transition? And here are some of those factors that make fertility decline even further. And those factors are related to behavior, to demographic behavior. So now people are getting married at older ages. So people go to school, invest on their education, and then try to get a job, and then they get married. So they postpone getting married. There are increases in cohabitation. Partners, they might be living together even before they get married, but while they are cohabiting, there is a higher chance of them not having kids. They postpone having kids while they're cohabiting, and just after they get married, they have kids. Of course, there are different trends, people having kids before getting married, and people having kids even before cohabiting, and so on. But this increasing age at first marriage and increasing rates of cohabitation influences further declines in fertility. Increases in divorce as well is more culturally acceptable, is also related to fertility declines. Emergence of same-sex partnerships and marriage is more culturally acceptable. And increasing rates of non-marital childbearing. So now I just mentioned that still, of course, there are people who have children before getting married. And although those people are not married and they're having kids, that can have negative impacts later in their lives, as we mentioned before, because usually women who are not married and have children, and if they are younger, they tend to, for example, drop out from school, and that will affect their educational attainment later on and their jobs that they could get later in life. But these rates of having children before getting married are increasing over time, but they have not been so strong in a way to make fertility go up, okay? And there are more people that don't want to have children at all throughout their lives. So there's voluntary childlessness, people who don't want to have kids anymore because of being expensive and for several other reasons. And it's voluntary, it's not related to their biological capacity of having children, it's not related to fecundity. And this discussion about these further behaviors, demographic behaviors that have influences on fertility decline started being a major point in demographic discussion. It was introduced by Van de Ka in 1987, also by Lestag in different papers that he wrote. And they called this different demographic, the influence of these different demographic behaviors on fertility decline, they call this the second demographic transition. So the first demographic transition, we have the decline in mortality because of improvements in health, people getting better resources, and infant mortality declines, and people start to live longer. We have less deaths due to infectious diseases, mortality declines, and later on, fertility starts to decline as well. Urbanization, because now people realize that they don't have to have as many children for them to survive, they start to have fewer children, but also urbanization later on kind of influence people having less children because of being more expensive. That's the graph that I showed before. That's the first demographic transition. The second one in these countries that are in later stages of the demographic transition is related to what is making fertility further decline or in some cases go up. And this, when demographers tried to explain those factors, they came up with this different set of explanations here. And that's what it's known as the second demographic transition, as discussed in our textbook. And then further on, David Coleman tried to understand even other transitions, other demographic transitions, oscillations that were going on in different countries. And he emphasized in this case that there is an increasing tendency of low fertility countries relying on immigration to maintain their populations. So his main argument here is that, okay, first demographic transition, mortality declines, and then afterwards, fertility declines as well. Second demographic transition, the current changes, oscillations in fertility are related to these different demographic behaviors that we discussed before. And countries that have improvements in mortality, so people living longer, and fertility is going down, that means that you are going to have an aging population, right? You have fewer children, and when these children get older, the labor force size of that country is going to be smaller, and the older cohorts of older people getting older, getting retired, and they are going to be a greater proportion of the population. So you have declining fertility, improvements in mortality, you start to have an aging population process. And in that case, if you have proportionally a lot of older people in relation to people in labor ages, that can create economic pressures in a specific country, in a specific year. Because you're going to have fewer producers, those in labor ages between 15 and 64, in comparison to the consumers, those above 65 years of age. So you start to see this pressure in the system on retirement system, Social Security, and a way to solve this issue is to have immigrants coming to those countries. So that was the main argument that Coleman was making in his study is that exactly because you have declines in fertility, improvements in mortality, you pass through this aging population. Then you're going to have pressure in the country because you're going to have a fewer proportion of people in labor ages. How do you deal with that? You stimulate immigration. People from other countries in labor ages immigrating to a specific country so they can work for that country. And so this changes composition of national populations, culture, physical appearance, social experience, and self-perceived identity. So all this discussion that we have been hearing a lot in the US since the 2016 presidential election is being discussed for several years already, that countries now that have a fewer proportion of people in labor ages, they rely on immigration, both low-skilled and high-skilled immigrants that can do work, manual work in agriculture, but also immigrants that can work in the service sector, can work in more high-skilled occupations. But that changes the composition of the population of a specific receiving country. And that's related to what we have been talking here before about that majority-minority concept, that if we put together all minority groups in a specific category, they will be more than 50% of the American population the next years, the next decades. And the same change in composition happens as well in European countries that usually receive a lot of immigrants. So that also creates some backlash against immigrants. There is xenophobia, there is prejudice, discrimination. So these waves of immigrants that in the economic point of view is actually good, and we have been discussing that throughout the semester, that the negative effects of immigration on the earnings of native workers is not significant. And we're going to talk more about this in the coming chapters, most of the one about international migration, that these immigrants actually are good for the economy of the US, in this specific example that I'm talking. But these perceptions of the native population are not only based on science, they are based on beliefs, on identities and everything. So then you have a lot of backlash against immigration. And Lister, for the specific case of the US, even mentioned that the children of immigrants are the vanguard of the third demographic transition that will remake the US. He's pretty much, who are the children of immigrants? Second generation, right? The second generation of immigrants. The ones that their parents, or at least one of their parents, were born outside of the US and they are born in the US. These people are becoming a bigger size of the US population proportionally. And they will be important for future generations. But this debate here is not settled. There are some discussions going on, for example, in Europe, that a way to deal with aging population, now that you have this smaller proportion of people in labor ages, is try to make people enter the labor market faster. As you know, in Europe, education is free, so people can go up to grad school for free, and there is little incentive for them to finish education faster and enter the labor market. So there are some discussions about like maybe the need to implement some policies that even these people still pursuing grad school, they should also have some form of incentive to enter the labor market. And in some of these countries, still female labor force participation is lower than male labor force participation. Exactly because women don't have the opportunities to work in the labor market if they have children. They don't have support from the government in terms of childcare and all other activities. So if they have children, it compromises their ability to enter the labor market. So there are also some discussions that a way to increase the proportion of the labor force in the country is not only through immigration, but also increasing female labor force participation and also incentivizing people to enter the labor market at younger ages, right? That problem is not a problem in the US because universities here are so expensive that usually people enter the labor market at younger ages, but that's an issue in Europe. I'm not saying that Europe should charge expensive amounts of money for university, but it should have some sort of incentive for people to start engaging in activities in the labor market while they are in grad school or in college as well. But this debate here is not, like I said before, not settled, but it gives us an idea of where the discussion is going. Mortality and fertility declines a lot. There are oscillations in fertility. Oh, what are causing these oscillations in fertility? This set of explanations here based on the second demographic transition. Oh, fertility decline even further and people living longer, aging population. How do you deal with that? Maybe having more comprehensive thinking in a more comprehensive way about immigration policies, and also increasing female labor force participation and incentivizing people to enter the labor market at younger ages. So these are all discussions that are going on right now in demography. But as I mentioned before too, as we start to try to understand deeper all these changes in demographic indicators, we don't only look at the big picture, understanding all this, the first, the second, the third demographic transitions. We start to look at specific transitions within the demographic transition. So they are demographers focusing specifically on health and mortality transition, on fertility transition, on migration transition, and how those affect the age composition of a specific country, and how migration is also related to urbanization, because migration is not only between countries, but also within countries, people moving from rural to urban areas, and how all those transitions relate to family and household transitions. Like I showed you a graph for the US before, how families, they pass from corporate families, people working all together in agriculture, into those households in which only the man would work outside of the household, into more present days in which both men and women are working the labor market and providing resources. So all these transitions here are related to how the households are composed. So it also is related to this household transition. And all these factors impact society, right? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about these specific transitions, and then in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to talk about specific theories that try to explain fertility transition, mortality transition, and migration transition. And in the case of migration, subdivided into internal and international. So that's the idea of this chapter. Give you the big picture about theories of demography, and then afterwards discuss some of the theories, some of these major explanations about the reasons of why we are experiencing transitions in terms of fertility, mortality, and migration. Okay? So the health and mortality transition is pretty much we shift deaths at younger ages due to communicable diseases. So in previous centuries, countries, most of their reasons of people were dying, they were dying at younger ages, so infant mortality was really high. And those deaths were caused usually due to communicable diseases, infectious diseases, and so on. And then we start to tackle those issues, give better health services, basic infrastructure, treated water, sewage system, basic things, healthy habits in terms of washing hands before eating, or better sanitation also in hospitals. That has all impacts on reducing communicable diseases. And then nowadays we have more deaths caused to degenerative diseases that affect more older people. But for example, right now, during this pandemic, we actually have an infectious disease that is killing a lot of people and with higher degree among exactly older ages, among older groups. So there are oscillations over time, but the overall transition in terms of health and mortality is higher rates of communicable diseases among younger people in the past, and now higher rates of degenerative diseases among older people. In terms of fertility, is the idea that now we can better control how many children we want through contraceptive methods, and also we postpone marriage, we have better family planning attitudes and ability to access these contraceptive methods. So we change from a high to low fertility rates. And these high levels of fertility are usually called natural fertility. What would be the number of children that women would have if they were not controlling fertility and they were having sexual activities with their partners and they were healthy, no issues related to their health? So this term natural fertility, and we're going to discuss it further, natural fertility is related to how many children on average women would have if they were sexually active, not using any contraception, and they were overall in good health, right? So you pass from this situation in which there is no control of fertility, there is no use of contraception, not at least in a higher percentage, into a moment in which people start to control more fertility, being able to control more, being more accessible, more affordable to use contraceptive methods. So fertility transition is exactly the change from high to low fertility and the increase in contraceptive methods. The migration transition is really related to urbanization. Growth in the number of young people in rural areas will lead to an oversupply of younger people looking for jobs. So rural areas that usually have higher fertility and lower job opportunities, when people get in younger ages, like as young adults, these people will look for job opportunities in other areas, usually in urban areas. And so this encourages people to live in search of economic opportunity in urban areas, and that's exactly urbanization. So migration transition, in this case here, is emphasizing internal migration. But we could see this in a more global scale as well. Less developed countries having lower opportunities for people to work, and then these people start moving into countries that are more developed and have more economic opportunities, right? The other transition that we saw in that previous diagram, the age transition, exactly because now you have higher percentages of people in older ages because mortality is declining, lower percentage of people in younger ages because fertility is declining, and some countries losing people in labor ages because of immigration, and some areas gaining people because of immigration. And the same thing for internal migration. Rural areas, out migration. Urban areas, in migration. All these changes in mortality, fertility, and migration changes the composition of the population by age and sex, right? The age composition, the age transition, is usually called the master transition because it's influenced by everything, by mortality, fertility, and migration transitions. And afterwards, the age transition influences the first ones. Because as people get older, you start to have an aging population, and with an aging population, that will affect having fewer children in the future, because we have a higher proportion of people in older ages that have a lower chance of having children. Older people that change age composition also will be less likely to out-migrate to other areas, right? So there is a reverse causality there. Mortality, fertility, and migration transitions have effects on age composition, on age transition, and then age composition has effects on the three components in demography. And urban transition, I mentioned, it starts from rural to urban areas, so it's related more to urbanization. But as countries start to decentralize development, so more areas get more developed, it's not just few cities, then you start to see people moving from big cities to mid-sized cities, because even mid-sized cities, you can have good services, you can have good job opportunities and so on, good life standards. So this process in which you have urbanization, people moving from rural to urban areas, and in urban areas, people moving into suburbs, and then afterwards moving into mid-sized areas, right? So that you see here, for example, in Texas, how much Austin increased the size and population these last years, and really within these last 10 years. A mid-sized city now having all this immigration of people working in the tech industry and other different occupations. And those are people that were maybe living in even bigger cities and are moving to more, let's call us in this example, mid-sized city, right? So this process creates more complexity, and that's what the authors call here an urban evolution, because it starts to be more complex. It's not simple internal migration from rural to urban areas. You start to have urban to urban migration. And finally, the family and household transition. There is diversity in composition and structure due to people living longer, having fewer children, and then now you have an aging population, more people in older ages, and a higher percentage of people living in urban areas, either at bigger cities or mid-sized cities. Okay, so all these different sub-transitions, the mortality and health transition, fertility, migration, age, urban transition, family and household transition, they are so complex that a lot of scientists, they try to understand specific aspects of each one of them, right? So we go further from debating the big demographic transition and to try to understand each one of these specific transitions. And now, as I said, I will talk about major theories that try to explain fertility, mortality, and migration transitions. There are, throughout history, different social scientists, demographers, economists, geographers, political scientists, and so on, that try to explain all these changes that are going on in society. Why did we, in this specific case, what are the reasons that made people in the past having more children and now they're having fewer children? And in the textbook, we discussed three groups of theories. One which is called the wealth flows theory, the second human ecological theory, and the third political economic theory. So just to explain, we are trying to understand why fertility dropped in these last centuries, in these last decades, from high to low fertility. There are different social scientists trying to explain why it dropped. And these three sets of theories here will come up with reasons about it. And remember the first slide of this lecture that I discussed on Tuesday. These theories, they had some hypotheses, they collect data, and their data confirmed the hypothesis, and then it made the theory stronger. And then they tried to understand other countries. They had preliminary answers to those questions, which are called hypotheses. And then they test the hypothesis with more data, and the data confirmed the hypothesis, and that made the theory stronger, right? So these three groups of theories were tested in previous studies. So the wealth flows theory, developed by John Caldwell, mentions that fertility patterns depend on intergeneration flows of wealth and services. So, for example, in agricultural areas, when the whole family is working in agriculture and trying to produce food or other goods, there is an incentive to have more children, because children in the household will be labor to that family. So, and in that case, what if we are, the term flows here is saying where the wealth is going from and to. So in these agricultural societies, families have the incentive to have more children because children will work in agriculture and they will pretty much provide wealth to their parents. It's pretty much the parents using the labor of themselves and of their children to create wealth. And then parents will want to have larger families, because by having larger families, their children can work with them and they can produce more and they can have a better life standard, right? So they produce more, they can sell it more and make more money and so on. In more contemporary societies, it's the opposite. When we start the urbanization process, people move into urban areas, it's expensive to have children. We have to take children to daycare. We have to take children to school afterwards. We have to provide them good health. We have to provide them food that's expensive. We are not producing food. So we have to provide good education. We have to provide housing. We have to provide food. We have to provide health. All those services are expensive for families to provide to their children. So families will have a lower incentive to have more children. So they will tend to have smaller families because the wealth goes from the parents to the children. Parents work, and with their money, they pay for housing, they pay for food, they pay for education, they pay for health services for their children, and all that is expensive. So his main argument in this wealth flows theory is that if children provide wealth in agricultural societies, if the flow goes from children to parents, yeah, the flow of wealth, yeah, so let's have more children because they are good, economically speaking. And then if it goes the other way around, in more contemporary societies, you have lower incentives to have children. And throughout this context, you have this process called emotional nucleation of the family. So now parents become less concerned with ancestors and extended family, and they are more concerned with immediate relatives, children and grandchildren, right? So you are dealing more with like nuclear families, and you're trying to provide wealth for those people. You might still have interactions with other family members, but it's smaller and you lose more help or, let's say, linkages with other relatives that are more farther away, right? What about the human ecological theory? Dudley Poston, who is the author of this textbook, and Park Frisbee. Park Frisbee, he was a demographer He died recently, and he was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the sociology department. And they, years ago, developed this human ecological theory for several aspects of demography. And it can also be applied to fertility. What is this term here, ecological, referring to? Ecological in this sense means that we are doing a macro analysis. The previous theory, the wealth flows theory, was looking more at the family level, decisions being made by families because of the wealth of flows between children and parents. In the human ecological theory, you are looking more in a macro level perspective. Whenever we use this term ecological theory, and we are talking about, I'm looking at the aggregate level, right? And there is also another term that you might have heard called ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy is when we have data for the aggregate level and we start to make wrong interpretations as specific individuals made specific decisions. So for example, a classical example for ecological fallacy. Let's say that we have cities A and B. And city A has 70% of the population is African American, 30% white. City B is the opposite, 70% white and 30% African American. Right? So more white here, more African Americans here. And let's say that the homicide rates in city B is higher than in city A. I just have big numbers, more whites here, more African Americans here, higher crime rates here. And if I say, oh, the crime rates are higher in this city because there are more African Americans, that would be an ecological fallacy. Because I do not have the data for each individual. I just have the data for the aggregate. Maybe the 30% of white living here are the ones committing more crime. But in this example that I'm giving, I just have information for the macro level for these two big cities. I don't know exactly who committed crime. What's the race, ethnicity of each one of the individuals? I know that here I have more white, more African Americans, and here I have higher crime rates. But I don't know who did it. And if I do say that's because of African Americans, I am committing ecological fallacy. I'm making a mistake in the analysis of my data because maybe exactly the minority white is the one committing more crimes. So whenever we are talking about ecological theories, and they are applied, this term is really applied in social science a lot, is that I'm taking into account a macro level perspective. And if I have a macro level data and I start to treat them as they were collected at the micro level, I'm making a mistake. I'm engaging in ecological fallacy. Okay? So those terms are important for us to know in social sciences. So in this macro level perspective of the human ecological theory, trying to explain why fertility declined over the years, there is a focus on societies, not individuals. We try to understand the level of organization and complexity of society. And usually what we see is that more organized, more complex societies usually have lower fertility. So more organized and complex societies, they are negatively related with fertility growth. As societies get more complex and start to be we have more specialization of occupations and so on, people will start to have fewer children, right? High fertility makes a population vulnerable to environmental, technological, and other kinds of societal changes and fluctuations. Large quantities of sustenance are normally consumed by the familial and educational institutions. So in more complex and organized societies, in those societies, we need more resources to survive. We start consuming more. In more complex societies, we consume more. Not just in terms of food at the family level, but we consume more services, such as educational services, health services, and everything. So high fertility would make a pressure in our society. So we, as a whole, decide to have fewer children. Lower fertility enables more sustenance to be available to invest back into the system. So as a whole, in this macro level perspective, people realize that if I have too many children, that will put too much pressure in society. So I decided to don't have children as much as before. So newer generations will have lower levels of fertility, and that put fewer pressures in the society. The third one that's discussed in the chapter, the political economic theory. The political economic theory, it's not actually a fertility theory, as is discussed in the textbook. It's more research strategy. So he calls here an investigative framework, an analytic perspective. And in this case, it tries to link both macro and micro level perspectives. So there are different theories that try to explain fertility. We are focused on these three here. But the wealth flows of fertility focus more on the micro level. The human ecological on the macro level. The political economic theory tries to take into account all these different factors, both macro and micro level. And usually at the macro level, you have more quantitative data. Through surveys, censuses, you have this big picture of what's going on with that population. It's usually more qualitative data. And to understand in more detail what's going on at the individual level, you can do some qualitative research that I mentioned also in the first slide of this lecture. So I combine both of them, but not necessarily all micro level analyses are qualitative. I'm just saying here that they try to have a set of explanations about why fertility decline based on macro and micro perspectives and collecting all sorts of data as possible. Of course, collecting quantitative and qualitative data for the same research project, it can be really expensive. But then in the book, there is an example for a specific community in Italy that these authors were able to understand both macro and micro effects on why fertility decline over time. They were able to do this analysis with a life course perspective because they had individual level data available through the 19th and 20th century. This kind of detailed data at the individual level for so many years is really rare to encounter. But in specific communities, in this case in Casalecchio, they got that data and allowed them to understand changes in historical events, such as age in which people enter the labor market, employment rates, occupations of people, when people get married, at which age, what was the average age of marrying of men and women throughout all these decades, right? Through the 19th and 20th century. And their main findings is that there are different factors influencing fertility, both at the macro and micro level. Fertility reduction depends on social class and occupation of families, so it depends more at these macro structures of the society, which social class I was raised on. I had access to specific services when I was a child with my parents, that will affect how my fertility is going to be later on. Where I grew up in terms of social class will influence my fertility when I become adult. Even occupation, which occupation I engaged in when I was in the labor force also will influence my fertility decisions. And these macro factors varied through different classes of people by individual characteristics, right? By age, by education, by race, ethnicity. I mean, the race ethnicity is seen differently in Italy than here in the US. But all these different individual characteristics also influenced fertility later on. The main idea that I'm trying to explain here is that fertility declined in the last centuries, in the last decades, from high to low. Why did it decline? And I show here three sets of explanation. One that emphasizes the micro level, wealth flow theory, the historical ecological theory that looks more at the macro level, and the political economic theory that links both the wealth flows theory and this more macro perspective of the human ecological theory into this more investigative framework, if I'm available to get all this data, right? Yeah, I think I mentioned before here, historical ecological theories, human ecological theory. And now, what are the major theories that try to explain changes in which diseases are the most prominent and also in mortality rates? So, whenever we are talking about health and mortality transition, we have to remember we are dealing with like two aspects, health and death. Which are the diseases that are the most prevalent in a specific population? I'm talking about morbidity. I'm talking about diseases. I'm talking about health. What's the pattern of death? How many years on average people live in a specific society, in a specific year? I'm talking about death. I'm talking about mortality, right? So I have these two aspects. What are the most prevalent diseases in a population, morbidity, and how long people survive? I'm talking about death. I'm talking about mortality. In Omran, he discussed the epidemiological transition theory, in which societies, they change from a prevailing poor health. Poor health means what? High morbidity. And these societies also had high death rates, high mortality, into a society with good health, low morbidity, and low death rates, low mortality. So previous decades, in previous centuries, you have societies that had really high morbidity, high mortality, and then we move into this low morbidity, low mortality societies, more contemporary societies. In those previous ones, as we talked before, most people were dying at younger ages because of communicable and infectious diseases. And communicable and these infectious diseases are usually more severe at babies, at children. So infant mortality at that time, in previous centuries, was really high. So a lot of babies dying before reaching age 1. But again, infectious diseases are not only always more fatal among younger people. The pandemic right now is more fatal among older people, right? So it's just the overall pattern is that in previous societies, you had really high levels of mortality with poor health, and a lot of these deaths were caused by high levels of infectious diseases and communicable diseases at younger ages. And then in more contemporary societies, most people die at older ages from degenerative diseases. right? So that's the major theory that tries to explain these changes. When we develop as a society, we start to tackle the causes of communicable infectious diseases. How do we tackle that? I mentioned today. If we simply have treated water going to the households, sewer system, we start to change our health habits, wash hands, basic things, measures that are done during childbirth, being more clean, all these things, they decrease the chances of people dying because of infectious diseases, right? Wearing a mask, everything, right? So these basic changes that were done centuries ago are important to understand this transition in health and mortality, right? And going deeper into that, Omran discusses the demographic theory of mortality. And in that case, he also suggests different stages, as we have the stages for the demographic transition theory. So the first stage, it's known as the age of pestilence and famine. You have high levels of people dying because of influenza, pneumonia, smallpox, tuberculosis. And there is a high infant mortality rate. Children dying before reaching age 1, a high childhood mortality. Children dying high rates before reaching age 5 and before reaching age 15. And the overall average life expectancy was really low. People used to live on average only around 20, 40 years. And in developed countries, this first stage lasted until 1875, right? Developing countries went further, but these really low levels of life expectancy, we don't see them in more contemporary societies, even in developing countries. The second stage is the age of receding pandemics. Mortality declines because of what? Because of the things that I just mentioned before. Improvement in sanitation, treated water, implementation of sewer system, and so on. And then improved standard of living of people, public health measures. You start to have better hospitals, better clinics, health clinics for people. You have better medication. You have vaccines. You have all that available to a bigger proportion of the population. So the average life expectancy increases, but it's still low compared to contemporary numbers. It's still around, people live on average around 30 and 50 years of age. And in developed countries, this stage went from around 1875 to 1930. The third stage, the era of degenerative and man-made diseases. So now you start to have higher rates of people dying because of heart disease, cancer, stroke, and so on. Mortality declines are due to medical advances in prevention and treatment of infectious diseases. So now we don't treat people of a specific disease after they have the specific disease. It happens before as a prevention. And then that's when vaccines are really important throughout this process. And life expectancy increases a lot and exceeds 70 years of age on average for several different countries and societies. And when we reach that place in which mortality declines so much and people start to live longer, that the oscillations in fertility are the ones that are the main factor influencing population growth, what I talked before. Because fertility keeps moving up and down, so whether we have a positive or negative growth is more related to fertility oscillations. And the fourth stage, that's more a discussion about contemporary developed countries, It's also called this hybristic stage, in which individual behaviors and lifestyle influence mortality. So accidents, alcoholism, suicide, homicide, smoking, diet, all these different lifestyle issues and social pathologies, they start to be influential because mortality reached so low levels as a whole, looking at the whole macro level, using that human ecological theory. And now what makes some people dying faster than others is more related to their individual decisions, right? To their lifestyle and to specific social pathologies as well, because some people, because of neighborhoods where they're grown up and poverty of their families and all social inequality that we have, people are more susceptible to be to experience homicide, suicide, and be and suffer accidents and issues of alcoholism. So these social pathologies, of course, I'm not saying here that's only related to individual behavior. Social pathologies is also related to how our society is organized as a whole. But you start to have more influence of individual behaviors as well. But you could also say that smoking and diet is also related to more aggregated level decisions of where those people grow up and how they are they receive their education and so on, right? So there is also a macro aspect here, not only micro aspect. And then now we pass to the theories related to migration. In migration, I will separate the slides here into some theories that try to explain internal migration. Internal migration are those movements of people moving within countries, and international migration, people moving from one country to the other. And international migration then is the permanent change in residence that occurs within a country and international between countries. And these terms here are important. When we are talking about internal migration, let's say I'm talking about migration from rural to urban areas in a specific country. Or let's talk about internal migration from California to Texas. That's internal migration. If I'm trying to understand what are the characteristics of these people that are moving into Texas and how that's changing Texas, I'm doing a study from the point of view of the destination area. So I'm doing an analysis of in-migration. If I'm back in California and looking how people migrating out of California are affecting the Californian state, then I'm doing an analysis from the point of view of the sending area, of the origin area. So I'm doing analysis of how out migration might affect the sending state, in this example, California. If I'm doing analysis about migration from Latin America to the US, and I'm trying to understand how migrants influence the society in the US, I'm doing this analysis from the point of view of the destination, of the receiving country. I'm doing an analysis about immigration. If I'm trying to understand how these people getting out of Latin America, moving to the US is affecting the countries back in Latin America, because now you have fewer people in labor ages to work in those countries, because those are usually the migrants that move from Latin America to the US. I'm doing an analysis based, trying to understand how this migration affected the origin countries, the sending countries. I'm doing an analysis about immigration. So I'm just trying to explain here that the same set of people, depending on the point of view that I'm doing the analysis, can be called in migrants or out migrants, if I'm talking about internal migration, or are called immigrants or immigrants if I'm talking about international migration, right? Let me just. And there are several factors involved in migration. Fertility and mortality happen in response to biological and genetic and social factors. So some women, they have children both in part of biological reasons and social reasons. Some women might want to have children, but biologically they have some issue in terms of fecundity, they cannot have children. Some women, because they want to invest in their education, they want to have less children. So fertility is influenced by both biological and social factors. The same thing about mortality. Some people might be raised in the same social class, in the same city, have the same occupation, same race, ethnicity, same level of income, but some of them might die faster than the others, because mortality is also not only related to social factors, but by biological factors. The difference is that migration has no biological factors. A person migrates due to factors in the physical and social environments at both areas of origin and destination. Individual factors can influence migration, individual characteristics, but they are not related to biological characteristics, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how usually healthier people tend to migrate more because they are more able to succeed in this process of moving from different areas. But in that case, health, in this point of view, as discussed in the textbook, is not seen as a biological factor, but health related to the social environment in which these people were raised in the areas of origin, right? And then we start to ask, like, why people migrate? Migration happens in response to a reason that the person believes cannot be satisfied in the area of origin. And this study of trying to understand why people migrate, it has been asked for several centuries. Ravenstein has developed the classical economic development theory that he pretty much says that migration happens in this process that tries to create this regional spatial economic equilibrium. Areas that have higher levels of unemployment, you tend to have more out migration into areas that have lower levels of unemployment, and then it creates more regional equilibrium. So in this perspective, it's really an economic driven theory that people move from one area to the other, and people will keep moving until we reach this equilibrium. That's the perspective that Ravenstein was discussed back in 1885 and 1889. Migrants usually move from low income to high income areas. Usually migrants migrate from densely to sparsely populated areas. That's a little counterintuitive, right? Because when we talk about migration from rural to urban areas, rural areas actually have fewer people. Urban areas have more people. And you are seeing more migration from rural to urban areas. And this idea here of from densely to sparsely populated areas, it's more related not just to how many people you have there, but to the resources that they would have. Proportionally, how many people you have, how many jobs they have available, what's the education system that they have available for them, right? So if you have areas that maybe in number of population might be small, but they don't have enough resources, so they are seen in this explanation here as densely populated areas, in the sense that there are more people than the resources that they have available to them. Population streams are expected to happen between the poorest and wealthiest places and countries. So related to what I just talked here now, people move from low income to high income areas, in this case, from the poorest to the wealthiest places, from the poorest to the wealthiest countries. And Ravenstein, he developed these different laws of migration. Then he talked about that back in 1885 and 89, and it's still being used by current studies in migration. And these slides here on migration, I go further than what is explained in the textbook. So I go a little deeper. So there is more material here in these slides than in the textbook. Migration is affected by distance. Most migrants move only a short distance. So if I have an area that has a lot of job opportunities close to me, I will tend to move to that area than to an area farther away. Migrants often move in stages. As they leave one area, their places are filled by migrants from more distant areas. I move from rural area to an urban area. As people start to move in, I start to move to another place, right? Every migration stream has a compensating counter stream. So for every migration flow, we have return migration. So whenever you're talking about migration from Latin America to the US, there is also return migration from the US to Latin America. And it's a it's an important information because, for example, right now, if you're looking only at Mexico and the US, the net migration between those two countries is close to zero. Same number of Mexicans coming from Mexico to the US equals the number of those going from the US back to Mexico. But usually the counter stream is smaller in number. But in this specific example that I gave just now between Mexico and the US, it's similar. So there is zero net migration. Migration moving long distance often stop temporarily at major cities or centers of commerce located between the areas of origin and the intended and final area of destination. Urban residents are less likely to migrate than rural residents. Rural residents, exactly because having less resources, they migrate more. What are other factors that make people being more likely or less likely to migrate? Migration is not only due to individual decisions of people calculating advantage and disadvantage of areas of origin and destination. Intervening obstacles also should be taken into account when social scientists are trying to explain why human population is happening between two different areas. Distance, job opportunities, levels of earnings. What are the characteristics of areas of destination? Are there physical barriers or costs, coyotes, for example? Air ticket, bus ticket. What are the migration laws between two countries? All these are barriers that make me less likely to migrate from one place to the other. What is my information about alternative localities? What do I know about these other places? Maybe one country might have better job opportunities to me, but I just know about this one because that's where I have friends and relatives. So I tend to move to that one instead of this. Personal characteristics, individual expectations, my age, my level of income, my level of education, all that. What do we expect in my own life? All that has influences. Do I know people in the areas of destination? What is my social network? Social network is an important factor here, right? So those are all what I'm trying to explain in this initial analysis about migration transition is that we have internal and international migration, and there are different factors explaining why people migrate from one area to the other. And what I'm going to discuss here is a series of different migration theories. I'm going to present all these different theories that try to explain internal and international migration, but I don't want you to see them as kind of fighting with each other in the search for the correct answers of why people are moving. They are compatible. Some of them might be better to explain specific flows of people, and other migration theories might be better to explain other flows of people. So their importance varies according to specific context. Overall, when we are trying to analyze specific migration flows, it's good to test all different theories. And Douglas Massey, a professor from Princeton University, he has great papers in which he has all this refined data about migrants from Mexico to the US. So he knows all those individual characteristics, age, sex, education, race, ethnicity, but also he knows those people that moved from Mexico to the US, if they had previous relatives, friends, children that moved to the US before. That is information about social network that's not really easy available. And he collected that data through what is called the Mexican Migration Project for several decades already. And so it's important for us to understand these migration theories as complementing each other. Some of them emphasize individual factors, some of them emphasize contextual factors. The contextual factors are characteristics of the areas of origin and destination. And what is important, if we do have all this data, is to include all of them in the analysis and see which one is most important. And the characteristics of area of origin and destination are called the push and pull factors. What are the causes, what are the characteristics of a specific area of origin that's making people get out of there? Push factors, poverty, violence, what is that, unemployment? What are the factors of areas of destination that are attracting people? The pull factors, job opportunities, education opportunities, and so on, right? And these push and pull factors, there are several theories that use this term. They try to understand what are the characteristics exactly of areas of origin and destination that influence migration. Like I said, push factors could be loss of a job, poverty, violence, discrimination, low availability of social and life patterns, catastrophes like floods, epidemics. We see all these hurricanes happening, Harvey in Houston, Maria in Puerto Rico, and then people moving out from those areas, Katrina in New Orleans, right? Pull factors. What are the good characteristics of areas that attract people? Employment opportunities, education, good levels of earnings, better climate and living conditions. Texas attracting a lot of Americans to move here when they retire. When people move here to Texas, they don't expect to have the experience that we all had last week with the snow and everything. They are looking for exactly better climate conditions, right? Different types of activities that are available to people. So migration is a response to both push and pull factors. And here an important distinction. When people are migrating, mostly because they're experiencing all these negative factors in the area of origin, when migration mostly is a response to push factors, migrants tend to be negatively selected. What does it mean, negatively selected? Usually the ones with lower levels of education, lower levels of skills, will tend to be the ones out-migrating from those areas. And in that case, the area of origin is changed positively. One clear case, more contemporary case, is Syria with the civil war. The first people that start to leave Syria were exactly the most vulnerable people with lower levels of skills, start to migrate to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, to North Iraq. But then as the wars kept going, then everybody else started to move out. But when you have migration due to problems in the area of origin, usually people are negatively selected. Negatively selected meaning lower levels of education, lower levels of skills. And when people move to an area because of the good qualities of that area, not necessarily because I have problems in my area of origin, migrants tend to be positively selected, or in other words, better educated, have better skills, and are more productive and innovative. In this case, the area of origin loses a valuable segment of the population to the area of destination. Okay? So in the next class, I will discuss in more detail internal and international migration theories. We do not have a class on Tuesday because that's Texas Independence Day. So we see you guys again exactly 1 week from now. Right now, quiz 6 is open, and quiz 6, since I knew that we are not going to finish this chapter now, is about the previous chapters: age and sex composition, demographic changes in the US, demographic changes in the world. So the questions will be about those 3 chapters. The same thing, randomly selected questions, 2 questions about these topics. And next week, 1 week from now, I will give you an assignment that's going to be an open essay assignment. So you're going to have more time to answer that question, and it will be worth more points. So I will start with those extra credit activities. And the first one is going to be 1 week from now on Thursday. Okay? So thank you very much. I see you guys 1 week from now. Thank you.